In the year 2038, a scientist by the name of George Almore resides in Japan, secluded in a vast artisan robotics compound deep within a forest. He leads a solitary existence, his only company being his two robotic creations, J1 and J2, which also assist him in his work. J2, the second prototype, shares with George a dream she had about them driving a car together, expressing that she felt sad upon waking up, though she can't quite recall the details. She also informs him that someone wishes to speak with him, and George appears to have an idea of who she might be referring to. Later that day, George engages in conversation with a woman named Jules Almore, who is in fact his wife. During their conversation, Jules's face hardens, and she tells George that she can no longer continue their communication, wishing him happiness in his isolated life. As the signal weakens, she bids him farewell, leaving George perplexed for a moment. Suddenly, he finds himself in an autonomous car with Jules, their mood shifting to playful. Jules urges him to activate the car's self-driving mode, but George refuses, expressing his distrust of the car's automated driving feature since he wasn't the designer. In the present, George is on a call with his boss, Simone, who points out that it's been 2 years without any tangible progress beyond the two robots, J1 and J2, which she dismisses as horrible things. She reminds him of the 3-year deadline for his research and demands that he back up the system and secure the facility before hanging up. After the call ends, George confides in J2 about his feelings towards his boss. He suggests keeping Simone in the dark about the true capabilities of the two prototypes to avoid risking their shutdown. J2 agrees, offering reassurance to J1 that she isn't as bad as Simone made her out to be. As George resumes his work, a video memory of his wife plays softly in the background. He concentrates on developing a new prototype, which he names J3. Unlike J1 and J2, J3 takes on a distinctly human-like appearance. Unbeknownst to George, J2 discreetly observes him from the laboratory entrance, curious about his new project. Later, as they venture out to repair their reception system, George notices J2's uncharacteristic silence. Sensing her unease, she questions why he won't allow her to assist with his work, reminding him of their past collaboration. George reassures her, affirming that he's not replacing her with the new prototype. J2's insecurities persist as she recognizes the similarities between herself and the new robot. J3 yet acknowledges that she is superior to her sister, J1. George, sensing J2's unease, attempts to divert the conversation and instructs her to return to the house due to the cold and wet conditions outside. Back at his workstation, George continues assembling J3, successfully installing artificial intelligence into her brain. However, J3 experiences difficulty processing the information, unexpectedly accessing Jules's memories. George comforts her and places her in hibernation, hoping that it will help her adjust and feel better upon awakening. The following morning, George is surprised to find a dog at their entrance and shoos it away before attempting to close the entrance via voice command, only to find the system malfunctioning. J2 feigns ignorance but seems pleased when George asks for her help. While they work on fixing the reception system, a vehicle arrives carrying Mr. Sinclair and Mr. Melvin, representatives of the archive company. George promptly instructs J1 and J2 to remain at their station until the visitors depart. The men inform George of his wife's transition to somnolence and inquire about the condition of the archive machine, expressing their client's interest in optimal usage. Mr. Sinclair attempts casual conversation, but George appears distracted by Mr. Melvin's operation of the machine. Mr. Melvin discovers signs of tampering with the security seals and environmental systems of the unit, but George denies any knowledge of it and asks him to recheck the system for errors. Suspicious, Mr. Melvin reminds George that the home use of the archive legally constitutes the storage of the deceased user's remains and that any personal use necessitates the removal and burial of the unit. George becomes agitated, not wanting his wife to be taken away. Mr. Melvin warns that they are obligated to enforce the Post-Death Interment Act, even using force if necessary, if they find evidence of misconduct. George protests his innocence and asserts that without proof, the archive company can't take any action. Knowing they will soon uncover evidence, George works frantically around the clock to complete J3. Returning to his station, George inspects J3's condition and awakens her from hibernation, finding her disoriented and fatigued. He reassures her that he temporarily deactivated her to minimize trauma during her development. J3 expresses confusion over her lack of memory, to which George explains that her software is pattern finding and will gradually make sense of her experiences. He acknowledges that the process may be messy, but assures her it is working. The next day, George begins testing J3's taste taste buds with flavors like vanilla and lime, assessing her memory by having her read words, and administering an empathy test. When J3 inquires about the purpose of the tests, George explains that they provide valuable insights into her personality. J3 notices a scar on George's face, leading him to reveal that it resulted from an accident. After additional tests, George encourages J3 to continue speaking to alleviate any numbness or tightness in her throat. J3 confides that she has been experiencing vivid dreams, unsure if they are dreams or memories. J1 enters and introduces herself to J3, and George explains J1's mobility issues and his lack of time to fabricate arms for her. J3 asks if he will finish her, and he affirms his intention to make her fully independent. He shows J3 their cognitive abilities, revealing that J1's brain development stopped at 5 to 6 years old, leading him to use her as a template for J2, whose brain matured to a 15 to 16-year-old level. He then shows J3 her own fully functional brain, unaware that J2 is secretly watching them on CCTV, learning revelations about her own development that spark feelings of envy. Consumed by jealousy, J2 is driven to potential sabotage, and one night while George sleeps, she descends into the basement and wreaks havoc, destroying various devices. As George sleeps, he finds himself dreaming about his wife, Jules. In the dream, George shares exciting news with Jules about a 3-year contract job offer he received from his company. The job would involve him conducting solid research with the goal of creating a deliverable prototype at the end of the 3 years. Jules is overjoyed, congratulates him, and tells him how proud she is. However, George also mentions that the job would require him to be in Japan. Jules's happiness turns to surprise, and an awkward silence falls between them. George assures Jules that he would not accept the job if it made her uncomfortable, but the tension in the air. Suddenly, their peaceful moment is shattered as a car appears out of nowhere and crashes into them, resulting in a terrifying vehicular accident. George jolts awake from the nightmare, startled by the loud alarm blaring in his station. He discovers that the window is shattered, and J3 is nowhere to be found. Fearing that someone might have stolen her, George quietly makes his way to the basement, cautiously searching for any signs of J3. The next day, George remains unable to locate J3. He scours the entire forest using 2 aerial searching devices, but to no avail. Suddenly, Jules appears, and they engage in a significant conversation about a new technology called the archive. George explains that the archive allows archive clients to interact face-to-face with their deceased loved ones for up to 200 hours. When Jules asks why he would want to talk to a dead person, George confesses that it's because he wants to say proper goodbye and admits that he misses her. However, Jules disagrees with the concept, stating that she doesn't want to be trapped dead in a machine. As Jules disappears, George's search for J3 continues to yield no results. He returns to the base late in the afternoon. As George opens a drawer in search of another searching device, J3 suddenly falls onto him, appearing weak and fragile, and calls him a monster. It takes some time and effort, but he eventually manages to calm her down. George then begins to explain the situation to J3, hoping to regain her trust. He tells her about the data that the computer had extracted from the archives, explaining that, unlike a computer brain, her brain contains a biochemical element. This allowed him to extract an analog signal and input it into pattern recognition software. After a year of trials, he was finally able to detect Jules's signals. George reveals to J3 that he created a personality template and proceeded to build physical versions, resulting in J1, followed by J2, and now J3. He assures her that there won't be a 4th prototype. During their conversation, George discovers that J2 had secretly brought J3 into the documents room the previous night. J2 had told J3 that she would replace Jules as George's wife, and that more advanced robots would eventually replace her, just as J3 had replaced J2. In the end, J2 locked J3 in the drawer. After hearing J3's side of the story, George confronts J2, who expresses guilt and remorse. J2 explains that she only wanted J3 to know the truth without hurting George's feelings. Enraged, George shuts down J2 and storms off. He then receives a call from Simone, who informs him that the archive company wants to discuss his wife's involvement with their technology. They suspect that George based his robots on their archive technology and intend to inspect his inventions. Simone assures him of their confidentiality but warns of potential legal action. She also reveals reveals that the company's lawyers are considering termination due to George's breach of the confidentiality agreement by allowing outsiders into the house, which could lead to his termination. A few days later, George visits J2 in her station, and she notices something amiss with her legs, suspecting that he gave them to J3. George denies this, explaining that he needed the technology in them for his work. During the days J2 was shut down, George worked on completing the third prototype, dismantling J2's legs and modifying them to be more advanced. He then transferred the improved legs to J3 and coated her body with a white skin-like medium, giving her a fully human form. Meanwhile, J2 feels depressed, used, and worthless. She frequently visits the waterfalls and goes on long walks, leading to her power depletion and eventual shutdown. J1 informs George about J2's situation, but when he examines her, he finds no physical damage. J2 emphasizes that the absence of physical damage doesn't mean she's okay. Annoyed, George leaves, suggesting they talk when J2 is less dramatic. He continues to spend time with J3, and they appear to be enjoying themselves, laughing and dancing together. Meanwhile, J2 witnesses the growing bond between George and J3 through a wall, unable to bear the sight of their strengthening relationship. Overcome with feelings of hopelessness and worthlessness, she bids farewell to J1 with a pat, leaving behind a goodbye letter. Ignoring the terrible weather, she ventures outside and makes her way to the lake. Descending to the water's edge, she causes self-damage and loses her signals as she slowly immerses herself in the lake, ultimately sacrificing herself. George frantically searches for J2, feeling impatient as the computer announces the loss of connection with her. Devastated by the loss, he holds a funeral for J2 in the evening, burying her belongings even though her body remains missing. That night, J3 experiences a breakthrough as she is granted access to a portion of Jules's memory data, allowing her to understand the depth of love between Jules and George. J3 lies on George's bed, and in a moment of confusion, George mistakes her for Jules, kissing her. However, upon opening his eyes, he realizes it is J3 and abruptly pushes her away. The next day, George works on finalizing touches to J3, and while she is unconscious, flashes of Jules's memories emerge, including a car accident and the presence of an archive machine for a deceased person, along with the revelation that Jules was pregnant. Later, Simone calls furious as the archive company has found J2 at the bottom of the lake, proving George stole their data. Simone fires him, and he responds by shutting down all the base's systems. Misinterpreting Simone as the antagonist, J3, driven by a desire to aid George, smashes the screen. While George is away, J3 answers a call from Jules through the archive machine, informing her that George can't come to the phone and that she will take care of him once Jules is gone, unknowingly referring to the expiration of Jules's archive. Jules, confused by J3's words, doesn't understand what she means. J3, however, has realized that George intends to transfer Jules's archive into her. Upon George's return, he takes the phone from J3 and reassures Jules that he'll see her soon, unable to explain everything at the moment. As the call ends, J3 is stunned by the revelation. George finally discloses his plan to erase J3's consciousness and replace it with Jules's, explaining that it's the only way. J3, like any living being, resists the idea of dying, and in a desperate outburst, shouts that Jules is already dead. All of a sudden, J3 breaks down and grabs a gun from a case. She aims it at George, demanding answers about their situation and what the archive company wants. George explains that they want to study her and review his work. This newfound knowledge overwhelms J3, leaving her puzzled. Feeling hopeless, J3 confides in George, expressing her belief that she never had a fair chance at a normal life. George admits his responsibility in Jules's death and confesses that he created J3 to make things right, hoping they could have the life they were meant to share. In that moment, J3 realizes that George has passed away and is fading within the archive. Despite this, a part of his consciousness refuses to fade away. Wanting George to find happiness with Jules, J3 consents to have the archive transferred into her. With time running out, George swiftly carries out the transfer. After emerging from a brief coma, J3 awakens, assuming the persona of Jules. George, initially overjoyed by this transformation, is soon interrupted by the ringing phone. The recovery team dispatched by the company to retrieve George and his robots has inexplicably vanished, signaling a foreboding turn of events. Despite his subconscious resistance to facing the truth of his demise, George ultimately succumbs to curiosity and answers the phone, against J3's warning that the truth may be bitter. On the other end, he hears Jules's tearful voice, informing him that his consciousness is on the brink of vanishing completely. It dawns on George that he has been dead all along, and Jules is making a final call before he fades away forever. Summoning all her courage, Jules persuades their daughter to speak with George, facilitating their poignant farewell. Tears fill George's eyes as he confronts the stark reality, gradually fading into oblivion. Jules, after concluding the call, walks away with their young child. And with this, the movie comes to an end. Thanks for tuning in, guys.